Here she is. Here she is. The woman who can wear Queen Elizabeth I's corsets as effortlessly and at the same time Bob Dylan's Ray-Bans, right? She's done it all.
And Parent Circle sneakers.
And Parent Circle sneakers. Look, she's wearing Robbie's sneakers. Okay, before we talk to Cate, though, I want to tell you something wonderful, wonderful's happened in the green rooms. This is the kind of stuff that makes me just the magic of women in the world sometimes. Two wonderful things have happened in our green room tonight. First of all, Bittier, I'm sure many of you were enormously moved to hear of the courage of the young girl who was raped and stood up to her assailants. Well, I've got to tell you something great that just happened. Manju and Sudhir Dhingra from Orient Craft have agreed to fund her education. Yeah. Yeah. What a thing. And something else wonderful has happened, right? Kasturi, the incredibly moving story of the young, the mother, grandmother actually, who went to Saudi Arabia to work to provide for her children and her whole family and suffered the terrible ordeal of having her arm cut off. Nita Ambani and their Alliance Foundation are going to fund the education of her 5 grandchildren. Yeah? I am so impressed by the fact that they were moved by these stories into wanting to take direct action. That is what I consider enormously exciting.
But I mean, that is the power of stories, isn't it?
That's the power of stories.
And also, frankly, Tina, of creating a forum where those stories are heard.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I consider myself a storyteller, but then it's so humbling, the real-life stories that I've heard today and the commonality of the stories. Yeah. I mean, stories of resilience and suffering, but also, I mean, how many times have we all heard the word dignity mentioned today? And even before we came on, Charu, an extraordinary makeup artist who's made you look incredibly beautiful and me look decent. Thank you, Charu. She was just telling me as she was applying lipstick to me how just this year she challenged the Supreme Court ruling that women could not be makeup artists in Bollywood. They could do hair, but they could not do makeup.
Wow.
Now, no one...
Why aren't we interviewing Charu?
Yes, Charu. Yes, well, I'm happy to go.
Yeah.
She's far more interesting than me. And she was the only woman, there was no support behind her, and she went to the Supreme Court, and this year she won the right to be a makeup artist in Bollywood, and already 400 women have become makeup artists in her wake.
That's
so remarkable.
That is so fantastic.
Backstage, that's not even here. It's incredible.
It is the power of story, as you rightly said. Well, you know, Cate, I know that you've really become more and more engaged, really, in a sense, in the sort of the wider world. I mean, you've always been a person who brought, you know, tremendous sensitivity to all these roles that you've played. But you've also, in recent years, I think, you're turning more and more out to the issues of the world. What's the change? What brought this about? Your increasing engagement with humanitarian issues.
Well, 8 years ago, my husband and I returned to Australia to take... I'm a very private person, and to take on a very public position running the Sydney Theatre Company. It's the largest of the state theatre companies, and so even though we receive very little government funding, we became advocates for the sector as well as producing work. So I think it forced us in a way to become part of the national cultural conversation. And as a result of that, I suppose my children are of an age now, not now baby, but where, you know, I have a little bit more time on my hands. And that, I mean, talking about women stepping up to the plate, it is often the duties of... I mean, I have a very supportive partner, but being bound up in family issues often prevents one from engaging in the broader world, and I think probably I was a little bit guilty of that.
Now, do you think that movies themselves can be agents of change? I mean, do you get attracted to roles because you feel that they are going to illuminate issues, or is it really only about, this is great material and I want to do it?
Well, I'm not a political animal by nature, and I don't think that... I think art and cultural product, it's a provocation, but I don't see my role as a political one. For instance, it was really interesting to hear the extraordinary women behind Fire, which is as revolutionary in 96 as it is now. And I've just recently made a film with Todd Haynes about 2 women falling in love in the 1950s, released this year. And the film itself is not political, but what happens is once it's released into the wider world, and it's all about context, isn't it? So the work can become political, but my motivation to get involved in it is really just about the stimulation of the conversation and the hope that if I'm engaged, then people are. But I do think your role as an actor, as an artist, is not to be polite. It's to provoke. It's not there to be liked. I mean, people will dislike what you do as much as they like it, but it's to provoke a conversation. But you can't necessarily then try and micromanage it. So, I mean, I'm interested in, certainly our work at the theatre company, we were very interested in, we did a work about drought at the time that there was a terrible, terrible drought, and so we went into remote communities and worked with community members to sort of tell their stories back to them. I mean, a lot of farmers were suiciding at the time, and it was a very powerful work. And so I think that sort of level of stuff is important. But it's
well, in the filming of Carroll, it's an extraordinarily moving and sensitive film about an older woman who falls in love with a younger woman.
I'm the older woman, not the younger woman anymore.
An affluent older woman who falls in love with, she's a girl who works at a department store, played by Rooney Mara. What kind of psychology did you bring to the creation of Carroll? Because there's such a sense of you're inhabiting this woman who is going through such a sort of inner conflict, and at the same time this enormous passion.
You're doing it right now.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
You're channeling it.
I know, but you see what I'm doing.
I've spoken to you before.
No, it's just I want to know what went into that part. How did you create that part?
But see, it was created by another woman already. Patricia Highsmith wrote the novel. And it's very interesting to be in dialogue, even though I never met Patricia Highsmith, but with such an interesting woman. And then Phyllis Nage wrote an incredible screenplay. So already I'm in dialogue with two incredible women who've made enormous suggestions. And the interesting thing about working with Todd, and Shekhar Kapoor is a director like this as well. He is masculine enough to include a feminine sensibility. And so Todd's frame of reference was all of these female photographers who were working, some of them underground and not recognised in their lifetimes during the 50s. And so the gaze of the film is inherently and richly female. So it was part of the gaze that I worked with as much as the psychology of the character.
Yeah, richly female is what I was sort of trying to drive at in all that
I got it.
hectic body language. You're also, of course, in the film, it's also about age difference. I mean, the barrier to love between these two women is also not just gender, it's being the same gender, but also it's about an older woman and a younger woman.
Well, like fire, yes.
Yeah, very similar in that sort of sense, which is very, very interesting indeed. Many directors have talked about what they call the fluidity of your acting. Actually, Shekhar Kapoor said, you're willing to throw yourself into a chaotic state out of which something will arise. What did he mean?
Try being at our house at 6 a.m. and Shekhar will see chaos. I don't know. I don't think. I mean, it's. Think of all the people that we've listened to today. I mean, life is chaotic. I mean, Shekhar's email is existing chaos. I mean, he, for one, understands that. I think. I mean, if you're involved and engaged in an empathetic way, as one has to be when you're trying to inhabit another person's psychology. And that's what I love about being an actor, is it's like active anthropology. You get to sort of really investigate not only a person, but the whole history that person and the people that they move with, what they bring to it. I mean, I'm sorry, now I've forgotten the question.
No, I suppose what I'm trying to drive at is, creating the Elizabeth I, tell us how you went about it, really. I mean, how did you decide, how did you learn to inhabit or create a character of Elizabeth I?
Well, look,
in Shekhar's movie.
Well, yes, I'm a passionate lover of history, and I bemoan the fact, we've talked a lot today about education, that history, maths, it's numeracy and literacy which is prized, but I think history is the subject that every child, history and geography, we all need to make sure our children have a broad sense of the geopolitics and the history of that, because it's that will carry us into the future. So I was passionate about Elizabethan history, and Shekhar couldn't have cared less. He was more excited by the fact that there was an Indian and Australian, two people who'd been colonised by the British, reinventing British history. I mean,
it's an act of revenge.
So, he and I fought the whole way along. It was a healthy, productive fight, and I think sometimes, if everyone is on the same page, if everyone is in agreement, then the creative outcome can be a little bit beige. I mean, that's why it's important that, like the other night after the Paris bombings, I forced myself to watch Fox News, because I thought I want to know what other people think about this, people that I might not necessarily agree with, because you need to have a complexity, a sense of the complexity of the situation. And the same was with that role. It
Right.
was Shaker and I fought the whole way along.
So, which of the directors that you work with do you feel has elicited the most, gratifying performance?
God.
I know. Go on, play favourites a little bit. Tell me about some of the directors and what they elicit from you.
I mean, meeting and working with Shaker was a real turning point for me. I mean, he really fought for me. I mean, I was an unknown Australian actress. He'd heard about me playing Nina in A Seagull on stage in Australia, and he just instinctually went for me and fought for me all the way along. So that was an incredible vote of confidence, which sort of changed the playing field. I mean, you only need one person to believe in you. It's like, the one teacher who you have, the rest could be shit, but you have one good one and that'll carry you through your whole education.
Yes,
one director. And so I was lucky enough to have quite a few good teachers, but also to have Shaker there at the beginning of my career. But I have really enjoyed, where do I start? Scorsese?
Yeah.
And working with David Fincher, doing 97 takes.
But of course, Woody Allen, with whom you did Blue Jasmine. You often have talked about, how much this creative process with the director is important, and yet Woody Allen never really does that, right? He doesn't engage in much great dialogue with the actors that he works with, and I gather that, he gave you the script of Blue Jasmine, and there really was very little conversation.
Well, a lot of his direction is in the script, but I think a lot of actors who ask questions are basically saying, did you like what I did? Which he doesn't know how to answer, and I don't blame him. But if you have a genuine question for him, then he'll answer it.
Yeah. That sounds very daunting. Okay, so in The Aviator, of course, you play Katharine Hepburn, who's an actress. You're an actress playing an actress, right?
And she was such an iconoclast.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a talk about changing the mould, the silhouette, but the mould for women, the attack. And people did not know what to do with her when she came out of the box. It's always, isn't it funny, the women who really change the game are always the women that no one knows what to do with initially.
And actually, the expression "a difficult woman" usually means an interesting woman, right? I mean,
Yes.
all the women in my family were difficult.
I know, and I remember when I first, you'd be asked a question by a journalist, when I came out of drama school, and they'd ask my opinion about something, so I would politely tell them my opinion, and then you'd read the article and it would say, strident, doesn't suffer fools, and you think, you asked me my opinion. It was but I do feel the language around which, the adjectives around which women are being described as, or perhaps there's just more female journalists.
Well, obviously, we've heard a huge amount this year about the discontent that's roiling amongst actors in Hollywood, actresses in Hollywood. I mean, they really seem to feel very wounded, and female directors and female writers, they're all saying they're excluded, they're not brought to the table, they don't get the good material, they don't get the good parts. What is your view on all of this? And it has sort of bubbled up tremendously this year, hasn't it?
I think there's a critical, and look, I mean, filmmaking is not the only industry in which there's not parity, either in representation or in pay. I mean, it's just that perhaps it's the most so-called glamorous end. Thank you, Charu. I think there's a critical mass of women across generations and across different disciplines within the film industry so that there's not one voice saying it. And so when the same door gets knocked upon, when you hear about, journalists are experiencing the same thing, women at Google are experiencing the same thing, then it gives you a greater courage to speak up. And even 5 years ago, that one felt a bit, being a harpy, if you mentioned it. But I think perhaps the media has enormous responsibility in how this dialogue is brought forward, and the fact that we don't then find ourselves in Groundhog Day back next November having exactly the same conversation. We want to move forward.
Right.
But I mean,
because this year they were saying it's the year of the woman in film, and I just thought that's
for fuck's sake, every year's the year of the woman. I mean, really.
I know it's getting old, right?
I mean, really, isn't it? I mean,
totally getting old.
I mean, do you envisage a time? I mean, this is such an incredible. Let me just ask you a question.
We made her a moderator. Now she's getting uppity.
Yes,
right.
I want a job. I'm auditioning. Do you envisage a time where such a forum will no longer be necessary?
Well, here's the thing. I do actually think that the co-opting of men and the bringing men into the conversation is entirely, of course, the next big wave of feminism. We've really got to stop talking to ourselves.
I mean,
right?
It was an extraordinary male perspective on women, that image of women banding together around the prison.
Yeah, I thought Govin was an absolute rock star
Incredible.
tonight. I think some of the, he was just extraordinary hearing his story. It's so important to bring those voices in. But let's get back to you.
No, you didn't answer my question. But it is interesting because, I mean, women, I think we did lose a lot of ground by saying, "Wow, we've got the vote. That's fantastic." And I think that, and maybe it's a generational thing that somehow women always want to separate themselves from their mother's generation, and that somehow the word feminism and all the positive sides of that term and the line in the sand that drew. It sort of wasn't mentioned anymore, and it became a dirty word. So
it also got very passive. I mean, I think particularly in America, feminism has become very passive in the last sort of 20 years. But actually, I do think it's changing now. And one of the things that I think is exciting is that the younger generation, my daughter's 24, and her generation finds it really cool to be a feminist. And that's new, because it was considered a very sort of, it's your mother's feminism kind of thing. I also think that listening to these amazing women from overseas who go through such unimaginable challenges is very energizing and kind of reactivates, in a sense, feminism in the West. But what I find very interesting about you, Cate, is you made some very, very interesting life choices. I mean, to be such a successful movie actress and then to go back to Australia and take over the Sydney
Australia's a
theatre.
very interesting
I
country,
know.
Tina.
But to take over the theatre company with your husband, that's an interesting choice. I mean, it's hard to work with one's own husband. How did that collaboration? I mean, my husband sometimes says, "You and I should edit a newspaper together." I think, no, thanks. I mean, that's a sort of scary idea.
Well, I mean, my husband and I have always collaborated. He was the first person that I felt that I could. I mean, the place that one works from, and there's a lot of creative people in the room today, the place that one works from is often it's deeply private. And so to find someone who's simpatico, a soulmate, someone who you can have an open, constructively critical dialogue with. You hold them with both hands, and then you sleep with them and have children with them. That's what I did. And so running the theatre company seemed like a natural expression of that. And he's a writer. I'm an actor. He's not at all threatened by what I do. He's one of the strongest people I know. So it felt to me when the offer came our way. I mean, we were CEOs, and I ran the company with him for 5 years. He's just about to wind up. He did it for 8. The only reason not to do it would have been fear. And there were a lot of people saying, "Well, you haven't trod the linear career path that entitles you to take this position." And I said, well, if you're talking about innovation, it's always the people who think out of the box. And it's interesting, we're on a lot of boards and a lot of panels, and one of the panels I found very interesting was about board diversity, about diversity in major corporations, and how there are not a lot of young people and very few women on boards. And boards make enormous decisions about the way companies are run. And it's the same thing. If you have people who think differently, then you will have more creative thinking. And so I think it probably helped us that we were, a funcking married couple, and that we hadn't run an organisation before.
Now, you had 3 boys together, and you just recently, just in March, have adopted a baby girl, right?
Yes.
What drove you to do that? I mean, I look at how much you're doing. I mean, you're a huge movie star. You're theatre, you're transatlantic, you're running around. It seems to me you have so much on your plate, and then you go off and adopt just when you're out of the woods, you adopted a baby girl. How did that? What was the process for that?
Well, we actually began the conversation a very long time ago. Actually, after our first son was born, and he's about to turn 14, and and then we just had 2 other children, and it sort of dropped off the radar. But I felt like we had space. We had enough emotional and enough room in our hearts, and we were privileged enough to have the capacity to have another child. So it wasn't about biology. But it's interesting you refer to our sons, because I was talking to a friend, Alison, earlier, saying during one of the sessions, it's so important how we raise our boys. And it's so important not only about their maternal figures, but also their father figures, and about how that unit functions. And so it's important for that reason alone to eradicate violence against women. And Gupta is amazing in his response to it. But I do think a lot about, there wasn't a desire to have a girl necessarily. The gender of the children has never been particularly important to me. It's more about their spirits, but it's been a remarkable thing watching them welcome her and become, a little troop.
So now you've ended the tenure at the theatre, and you're going to presumably now focus more on movies, or what are your next things that you're focused on?
I was very inspired by what someone said earlier. It said, make sure you look after yourself. I don't mind doing a bit of that.
Yeah.
Look, I don't know. I'm sort of waiting for the next big challenge. It was an incredible challenge running the theatre company, and with what's going on at the world at the moment, being an actress, I value cultural product. I mean, I think it humanises us. Telling stories, retelling stories, and frankly, sitting in an audience with people, it reconnects us all. We find the commonality in those stories. So I do think it's very important. But, on a day-to-day level, you think, maybe there's something more valuable I can be doing, and I'm not quite sure what that is.
We know how long it takes to bring projects to the screen. I mean, there's so many different variables and unpredictable elements that goes into getting a film made, as opposed to just wanting to get a film made. If there was something you want to just get going right now, all the financing there, everything, go, 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 what is the thing you most want to do? I mean, what story do you want to tell?
There's a story about an Australian woman whose name I won't mention, who suffered mental illness and used to go wandering, and she found herself falling through the cracks in Australia between the mental health system, the immigration system, and the criminal justice system. And because she went walkabout without her papers, she ended up at that time, the most brutal detention centre in Australia, Baxter Detention Centre. And so I felt there was an interesting story to tell there. So we're working on that.
Is that driven a little bit by what you've been seeing, what's been happening to the refugees, the detention centres in Australia, which I gather are absolutely appalling?
Yes, we've sort of had a mixed relationship with refugees over the years, Australia, and it's very strange, because on the one hand we are a nation that's built on immigration, and we're signatories to the 51 Convention, and in the past we've had very sort of generous resettlement programs for refugees, but in recent times governments have had, like a lot of governments around the world, have had quite sort of reactionary, backward-looking relationships to immigration policy, and in fact the previous Prime Minister got in under the slogan "Stop the boats," as if and then saying that he had, or the government had, but they weren't stopped. They were simply deflected to Papua New Guinea and to Nauru, and then I mean the reports that were coming back for there were horrifying, because when I grew up in Australia, and I adore Australia, we lived there. We want our children to grow up there, and brand Australia, as it were, when I grew up, was multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure many of the countries that we all lived, that prided us, have had found great pride in being multicultural, where somehow we're forgetting that recent relationship and all the wonderful things that migrants have done. Refugees have given our country.
And of course, Australia's built, by convicts who were.
Well, exactly.
Were
we're built on immigration.
Yeah. Well, we could talk all evening, Cate, Annan, but we can't, because we now have to
stop.
Stop. Exactly right. You're an extraordinary actress, woman, humanitarian.
You're
mind,
pretty extraordinary yourself.
And we're very, very thrilled to have had you with us in India. Let's give a big hand to Cate Blanchett.